Hello again, everyone. I'm Dr. George Simon, and welcome to another edition of the new Character Matters program, the program where we talk about what I consider to be the defining issue of our time, the character crisis that we have faced for several decades now and that affects every single aspect of our lives. We've always had our character-related problems, being flawed human beings. But over the past several decades, certain cultural factors have influenced our character development in a negative way. And as more and more character impaired people populated society, institutions and cultural structures meant to help foster character became increasingly corrupted, creating a negative, vicious cycle that we've been in for some time now and producing so many of the problems that we have today. And toward the end of turning things around, I have written all of my books in the hopes that we can reclaim the importance of character and also rediscover and support the time-tested principles that history has shown us help us be all that we can be as individuals and as a people. And today I'd like to talk about something that is really quite a complicated subject, but I'd like to make it as simple and as easy to understand as possible because it's one of the more fundamental things responsible for the character crisis that we've been in for some time. Folks who have read my work know that I sometimes criticize and quite strongly at times the traditional approaches that we've had, the traditional metaphors and frameworks that we've used to explain why people do the things that they do. And with respect to traditional psychological explanations, I've made the point that some of these explanations not only are not as relevant as they used to be because of the nature of our times, but actually can be quite harmful. Many times, folks stay in abusive or manipulative or other toxic relationships, primarily because they have heard certain things and come to believe some things about why people do the things that they do. And instead of trusting their gut hunches, buy into these notions that sometimes turn out to be very disadvantaging. I'm going to give you just one such example, and I'm going to use that example to explain why living in such a different socio-cultural milieu has changed the game as far as psychological explanations for human behavior is concerned. There was once a notion that when folks who committed serious misdeeds, seriously criminal minds, who engaged in horrible behaviors, but somehow got away with it, there was once a notion, and by the way, sometimes in some circles, this notion still prevails. At any rate, the notion was that the reason folks keep committing these acts over and over and over again is because of an unconscious desire to eventually be caught. That's right. There have been such theories promoted. The idea being that within every human being, there is a conscience, and that necessarily that conscience would bother a person. And that necessarily, because the conscience bothers a person and because the pain associated with wrongdoing is so intense, primitive defense mechanisms operating unconsciously are employed to save the person from internal unrest, anxiety, and emotional pain. So the person doesn't realize why they keep doing the bad things over and over and over again. But really, it's because their conscience is bothering them. They're overwhelmed with guilt that they block out unconsciously, but still want to be caught and dealt with. Now, I know that to some, this notion may seem a little absurd, but it was a prevailing notion for many years. And it's all predicated on the one assumption, that is, that everyone has a conscience, an active conscience, that goes to work and bothers them when they do bad things. And if that were true, then these notions would make sense. However, in our character-impaired times, the sociocultural zeitgeist being so different than it was many, many decades ago, all too many folks develop these days with an inadequately formed, weak conscience, or perhaps, as Robert Hare in his landmark book, Without Conscience, dares to say, in some cases, without conscience altogether. This is a relatively new phenomenon on such a scale. It's not that there haven't always been individuals with us who lack conscience, but the prevalence of significant conscience deficits in individuals during their character-forming years in our day and time is truly troubling. And it's precisely because folks don't have a solid, strong, internal moral compass bothering them when they do bad things, that they do bad things over and over again without compunction and with a sense of entitlement. And should they get away with it, as they sometimes do, time and time again, this only serves to embolden them. And it's misguided to think that they're doing these things over and over again because underneath it all, they're really troubled and they have an unconscious desire to be caught. This is folly in our day and time. Now, that's not to say that it can't be true sometimes. It can be true. But the main point that I make in all my books is that because of the socio-cultural climate of our times, and because of how we've lost the art of character formation, because we don't give it the focus we used to, because we don't expect it like we used to, and because we have lost our understanding of all that it takes to forge it, to encourage it, to reinforce it, so that we can come to expect it. Because we've lost all that in our day and time, there is more and more of what I term character disturbance, which is primarily a lack of adequate conscience formation, and therefore a lack of what we used to call neurotic personality development. By neurotic, we mean an inherent conflict going on inside a person between their conscience and their primal urges and impulses. When you don't have a well-developed conscience, that conflict doesn't even exist. Or at least if it does exist to some extent, it doesn't exist to the extent that it causes the kinds of psychological symptoms that used to be the subject of treatment. Today, unfortunately, we have more and more folks whose problems are related to their behavioral discontrol rooted in a lack of internal mechanisms meant to help us be civil. We don't have the inner structure, all too many of us, necessary to function in a more civilized way. And we don't suffer the qualms of conscience that would otherwise give us pause. I'll repeat that. That would otherwise give us pause, hold us back, or in some cases, push us to do the hard but right. That's what a healthy conscience does, and I'm going to have more to say about that in some upcoming episodes. But a healthy conscience does two things. It pushes us to do the right thing when it's tough, when it's not popular, when it would meet with disapproval, or when it would cause us some personal pain. So a strong, intact, well-developed, well-grounded conscience pushes us to do good, even when it's really tough. It also holds us back when our primal urges and desires want to do something that ultimately would not be in our interest or in the interest of the greater good. And so it holds us back, even though we have a strong desire, perhaps, to do something, to say something. That's what a healthy conscience is all about. And in the age of more widespread character disturbance, as opposed to neurosis, we have too many folks among us with poorly developed consciences. In the Victorian age, when most of our traditional theories were developed, and folks by and large had overly well developed, punitive, harsh consciences, all kinds of qualms, all kinds of inner conflicts, anxiety, distress occurred in people as they battled with their more basic urges and the oppressive consciences that they had, literally making themselves sick with worry, with fret, with internal qualms. Those days have passed. In the 60s, we used to say that people were hung up. That's the nature of neurotic pain, that battle between conscience and our more primal urges. And in the age in which our traditional thoughts about human functioning were formed, we had many folks who were overly hung up, who felt far too badly and became far too distressed at the mere thought of acting on a primal urge in a way that would be disapproved of or cause some difficulty. But we were also more civil, by and large. Now, neurosis is not healthy because when you deny the baser side of yourself, all kinds of things can happen when your defenses break down. And this has happened in history before. But we live in an age in which we are not riddled with people who are overly hung up. This is the age where, unfortunately, there are too many among us who are not hung up enough about the things that they let themselves do. And that creates quite a mess. And it poses quite a challenge for interveners, for folks who want to help people get better or to deal with problem circumstances. Because unless you approach these problems with the right mindset, things are not going to get better. Matter of fact, sometimes they get worse. That's the nature of what I call therapy-induced trauma. It is both unwise and unproductive to engage with those who are not hung up enough in the same manner that you would engage with an individual who is overly and unnecessarily hung up. It is not helpful to engage with individuals who lack what some researchers call adaptive fearfulness or appropriate anxiety about the things that they either want to do or have done. It is inappropriate to engage with them in the same manner that you engage with folks who are overly riddled with anxiety. And it's especially dangerous in our day and time to assume that the reasons underlying people's toxic or troubling behavior is rooted in insecurity, unconscious fears and anxieties, past wounds and pains. This can be true, and it can be even a part of the picture. But it's a dangerous assumption to make, and it's a dangerous perspective to hold when the greater problem is that the person is acting out of a sense of entitlement, lacking any motivation to impose internal restraints or controls upon themselves, and acting with reckless abandon, like they're the only person in the world that matters. We live in unique times that by nature have to change. The socio-cultural systems within which most of us live must self-correct. There's too much damage being done. Too many relationships are toxic as opposed to wholesome and growth-producing. The numbers are staggering. Healthy human relationships grow people in positive ways. Toxic relationships only destroy, only cause pain. And the root of so much of the trouble has to do with the lack of solid conscience formation that underlies most character dysfunction. And that's why I'll be having more to say about it in the coming editions of the new Character Matters. So until next time, I invite you to visit the blog at drgeorgesimon.com and avail yourself of all the timely free articles, and to avail yourself of all my books, In Sheep's Clothing, Character Disturbance, The Judas Syndrome, How Did We End Up Here, and of course, my latest offering, Essentials for the Journey. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, I'm Dr. George Simon. Take care.